On February 14th, voters will have a chance to decide on a replacement educational program levy for Spokane schools. Welcome to School Talk. I'm Taryn Roloff, and joining us today are School Board Vice President Dr. Jeff Bierman,
Hi, Taryn.
Associate Superintendent Dr. Mark Anderson,
Taryn.
and Superintendent Dr. Nancy Stowell.
Hi, Taryn.
Welcome to all of you. Dr. Stowell, explain to our audience the significance of a levy to a district's budget.
Well, there are only three major sources for a district to get revenue: from the state, the federal government, and then locally. And that local contribution is called the levy. And so the levy now makes up about almost a quarter of the district's entire budget. And that's the levy plus something we call levy equalization, which is about 14 million we get from the state of Washington because we're a property poor district. And we can talk about that more a little bit later. But what that levy does is it really provides programming that creates a well-rounded educational program for all the students in Spokane Public Schools, something that just state funding alone would not allow.
And that funding, that 24% supports a lot of activities that folks maybe think are part of basic ed, but really it's really needed to keep those programs going. Would one of you gentlemen like to talk about some of the things that the levy does support?
Well, yeah, it does all the extracurricular activities, sports, art classes, music classes. I think you're right, though. There's some things that people think are basic ed that levy goes to support. I mean, it's a lot of salaries, a lot of teachers to maintain reasonable class sizes, counselors, librarians, nurses. It's a wide range of additions that we get to put in the schools.
And some of our very specialized programs like online learning, that virtual learning that we're doing now that has really been popular with families, our gifted and talented program, part of that comes out of the levy. So lots of dropout prevention.
All the credit recovery and dropout prevention programs that we've been focusing on for the last 2 years that have had results, those are coming from the levy.
And there's even several items that the state is supposed to fully fund that we, because they're not, and because we're required to do them, come out of the levy. For example, special education. We spend about $3 or $4 million a year on required special education services for students who qualify. Just getting kids to and from school. There's about $3 million a year that we have to supplement what the state is supposed to fully fund. So there's parts of the levy that we're having to fund out of our levy that the state's obligation is to fund.
And you mentioned some numbers, so let's talk about what the levy amount will be for the February 14th election.
Well, this is a 3-year renewal, so voters will be going to the polls on February 14th to replace the levy that was passed in 2009 that's now expiring. It was a 3-year levy. This will be for that year's 13, 14, 15 that voters will be voting on. And it will range from about 73 million to about 75 million those 3 years if the state cuts this levy equalization assistance that Dr. Stowell mentioned. If they continue to fully fund it, then the levy amount that we can just collect by law will be about the same as it's been these last 3 years.
About, what is that, about 61
million a year. Right.
Yeah.
And when will we know about levy equalization?
Well, we probably won't know about that until the legislature finishes its short session, which will be sometime around the beginning of March. So we could know a little before then, but not likely to know much before that. So.
And what the board, the difficult decision they had to make is kind of guess what the legislature might do with this assistance, not just this year, but over the next 3 years, because we're setting the levy for 3 years, and of course the legislature will be back in session 2 more times during that period of time. So it was kind of a guessing game on what to put on the ballot.
Yeah, and so we've tried to make a reasonable guess, a reasonable estimate.
Right.
I think we've requested an amount for authorization that would allow us to cover about 2/3 of the LEA money if the state was to cut that amount, and still be able to meet that from the local community and be able to address that without having to lose programs and services that are currently being funded by the levy.
And if the legislature doesn't cut levy equalization, then we would roll back the money that
we just
isn't
actually
authorized.
couldn't collect it, and so the amount would be less that we would collect from our local community. and as I said, about the same as it's been for the last 3 years.
And I think that the important thing about the levy too is it is probably has been the only predictable source of revenue that we've had for the last few years, because the federal government and the state government both have been reducing their support for public education. So that levy is what we know is there and can count on to provide support for those programs that we were talking about.
Kind of pick up on that, it's more likely than not that we voters, if they approve the levy to continue that, will still have to make cuts.
That's right.
Because of the state portion of the budget pie is going down. So this is just trying to maintain or mitigate against more cuts from the state.
And those levy dollars really are the ones that are really flexible for us to be able to do
Correct.
a lot
That's
of
right.
programs. You know, when we recognized as a district that we wanted to put more energy and effort into those dropout recovery the programs and credit retrieval programs, those are the dollars we can use for doing that. When we decide as an emphasis to increase AP classes or maintain some sort of structure there, those are the dollars that allow us to do that.
Well, you know, and those kind of decisions too have been, they've borne fruit. Our dropout rate is down to 19% from about 38%. Our graduation rate is up to about 75%.
AP classes. And
We've been recognized nationally for the numbers of AP courses our students take and the fact that they are meeting standard on those AP exams. So those kind of investments of levy dollars have resulted in our kids being able to do well, and that's important.
And those successes that you just referred to are rather ironic in light of the fact that the state, as Dr. Anderson said, continues to cut back. And each year for the last 10 or more years, the district has had to make cuts. Talk a little bit about what the district is doing to reduce expenses.
Right. Well, we have been, over the past 10 years, in a period of having to tighten our belt and make some difficult cuts. At first, it was due mainly to student enrollment declining in the district. But then as we made reductions there, it's become more and more, I guess, closer to the classroom, closer to the schoolhouse that we've had to make decisions. But we've ranged from everything from cutting support services to custodial services to various programs. Like we, several years ago, had to pretty much cut our elementary sports and after-school programs. We still maintain our middle and high. We've cut central office administrators. We have raised class size over the years to levels that we think are kind of at the top of what we think is reasonable. I think at kindergarten through 4th, it's around 25 students in a class. To 5th and 6th grade, it's 28. To middle and high, it's at 30 students per class. So we've raised those class sizes to a point that I think when we were considering going even higher last year, the board heard pretty clear that the community wanted class sizes maintained if possible. So.
And we were only talking about adding a couple of students, and that did not resonate well with our community.
You know, it's important, I think, to piggyback off of that, though, when you were talking about state and federal funding reductions and our, the local community effects that's had with reductions we've already made. As Dr. Stowell said, the levy accounts for about 25% of our budget. And even if that's maintained, even if the community's, if when approved and we can adjust for any LEA reductions, there's still 3/4 of our budget that comes from the state and federal government. And I think we're expecting to see reductions there as well. So even with the levy passed and fully funding and not affecting that quarter of our budget, we're still going to be looking at some of those reductions, and it's going to be a difficult time.
It is, it is. You know, and I think that one of the things we've been good about doing, I think, is trying to listen to our community. You know, having those community forums and asking the community what matters to them. And we have really worked hard as a district and worked around the classroom so that we could stay away from reductions that affected students in the classroom. But we're at the classroom door now. I think we saw that last year when we talked about increasing class size. So other districts have had to cut counselors and librarians.
Right.
So if we continue to get reductions from the state, we're going to have to go there because we're 82% of our budget is people. So,
And one of the things that I think the community is really interested in is about administrators, because they are some of the salary, a percentage of each administrator's salary comes out of the levy, and that's just a fact. But there have been cuts to the administrative staff. So let's hear a little bit about over the years.
Well, the facts are of our levy, about half of our levy dollars goes for certificated positions and compensation. About 30% goes for our support staff. This would be for like secretaries and custodians and so forth, because the state doesn't fully fund neither our teachers or our support staff or our administrative. Administrative is around 9% of the levy dollars, and then the remaining part is for other types of things like contractual services, like our contract with our bus company to get kids to and from school. So that's kind of the pie of how the levy dollars are split up. We have been reducing administration. Matter of fact, the board, we recommended to the board about 15 central office administrators this past year. So we continue. That's a place that we look at first. I would have to say that we have maintained our administrative principals and assistant principal staffing just because they're working with kids so much at the schoolhouse. So we've tended to, if we've had to make cuts, cut what we call central office administrators first, and tried to keep our schoolhouse administrators intact.
and when you look at the percentage of central administrators that come out of the budget for Spokane and you compare it to the rest of the state, we're below the state
Yeah, we're
average because we've been making those cuts.
Right.
You know, even transportation, which I think families just assume is something that we'll always have to and from school. I just saw in California where they've eliminated funding for busing.
Right.
And so they're struggling now to figure out how to get
Right.
kids to and from school. And we're paying about, what, $3 million out of our levy
right.
now because the state's not fully funding transportation.
State's
and,
paying about $6 million.
Right.
We're paying
So-
about 3 more.
and
And that's an area the state's the
They
governor
did.
has talked
That's
about
right.
looking at here in Washington State. So.
That's right.
What about administrative salaries? And just go back to that just briefly. They have also been cut over the last couple of years.
We did. We this past year, for our central administrators and our principals, cut their salaries by 3% and didn't allow them to step up on the salary schedule and get more money. That was about twice as much as what the state cut us for administrative salaries. We tried to maintain our teachers' salaries because they had been reduced for, I think, 3 years in a row. So this year the board stepped in and said, even though the state cut us in funding for teacher salaries, we tried to maintain it at least for this year only. So.
Plus such a large fraction of our teachers have been here long enough, and they're
Correct.
far enough along on the scale that they don't get to step anymore.
Right.
So
That's true.
even
They're topped
when
out.
this, so whereas younger teachers were able to step, a lot of teachers weren't able to, and that was putting pressure. So it was good that we were able to do that for this year.
You know,
Teachers,
somebody- No.
teachers' out-of-pocket cost
Yeah.
for health care has gone up extremely during the last few years as health care costs has risen and the amount that they're given for health care benefits has not increased. Yeah.
Well, and someone asked me the other day, why haven't we reduced administrators at our schools, our high schools? And I said, well, we really are concerned about the safety of our kids, and the kind of complex problems that schools deal with now are so very different than even when I was an assistant principal. And the trauma that our children come out of, all of that, the increasing number of students with very high needs really does tax a school. And so, but ultimately we'll have to look at administrators at the school level as well. But schools are very different than they were a few years ago.
And like you said, that's really going to affect the level of services and
Right.
things that you're doing through the schools. And
Right.
Our
one of the
security officers,
things you've heard a lot lately is that there aren't as many resources for schools to turn to with families and kids that really need some assistance. So in a lot of cases, all that's available is through the schools, and that could very well change.
Going back to the percentages of where the money goes. Dr. Anderson, you were mentioning that I think you said 30% or so goes to support staff. Does that include the coaches for extracurricular activities, or where do they fall?
They do. They fall in that area because our after-school sports coaches and so forth are not considered certificated staff,
Right.
though we have teachers who often will do coaching, but they're considered support or classified staff for the coaching.
And the state doesn't give us a single dime
for that, right.
for either the extracurricular activities, clubs,
right.
activities, and sports, or the transportation for them.
For them, right.
Yeah, for them back and
Right.
forth
That's
to those
all local
activities.
levy.
That's all comes out of the local levy. So.
All right. Well, we just have a minute or so left, but certainly this is our chance to answer what we perceive to be some questions that the community might have about the levy.
Well, I think one of the important points is it's not a new tax. This is just replacing the levy that folks have been actually continuing for many, many, many years. So it's a replacement levy for 3 more years. I think, as we've said, if the state continues
Right.
helping districts like Spokane who are property poor, it'll be about the same as it has been for the last 3 years as far as the amount per thousand. And so I think those are a couple key facts. It's not new, but it's trying to, as we've talked about today, trying to maintain a little bit of a stable funding source that we have where we know we're probably going to get cut in other areas from the state.
And we know that we have all the information that we've discussed today on our website at SpokaneSchools.org, right on the homepage, so we encourage folks to go there. And as one of you mentioned earlier, it is our responsibility to share information, to share facts with the community so that they
And we've been
understand
out in
it.
the community trying to make sure that we share the facts. There is a citizens group that does the Vote Yes campaign that's separate from the Spokane Public Schools, but we have been out trying to make sure we share that message. And we do know that it's important that our community have a clear understanding of what kind of programs are paid for out of, what are we using those dollars for? I mean, I think that's a legitimate question for them to ask, and we need to be able to get out and share that information.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here today. And thank you for joining us on this edition of School Talk.